Bona tarda. ¿Se sent? Sí. Buena tarde, muy buenas tardes a todos. Voy a intentar, yo no os voy a poder acompañar, lo cual es bastante feo, porque en unos actos como estos lo importante es que nosotros, que antes me estaban recordando que soy político, y soy político, ¿no? Pues escuchar. Una de las funciones que deberíamos tener nosotros es escuchar más y no hablar. Pero bueno, forma parte del ámbito político también hablar, ¿no? Primero, bienvenidos a la Disputatio número 11 que hacemos en Barcelona. La Disputatio se celebró en Barcelona la primera en el año 1263 y el primer referente que existía era en París el año 1240. Y las primeras Disputatios eran de religión y básicamente eran la vinculación entre la relación, cuál era la verdadera, curiosamente, si era la católica o era el Talmud. Era una relación, con lo cual quien tenía el monopolio de la información, y con ello probablemente la de la verdad, era la religión hace escasamente 700 años. Y curiosamente, pasados 700 años, seguimos teniendo la misma discusión, pero ya no lo tenemos en ámbitos religiosos, a pesar que aquí tenemos una capilla que está desacralizada, pero curiosamente seguimos teniendo esta misma discusión pasados 700 años, ¿no? When I was young, everybody told me one of the major events of the history was the Johannes Gutenberg, because he invented the printing press in the 15th century. And the people say in that moment, this system can change the way we share the knowledge and the way we improve the democracy. There are one world before and another world after the Gutenberg event. And this revolution, the revolutions to share information, to share knowledge, accelerate when the development of the television, the radio, and internet. But the last state of this revolution is where social media and digital sources have replaced traditional media, and this replacement has two major consequences. The first, every one of us have the capacity to have access in any information you want. And secondly, every one of us have the capacity to share this information. And this combination creates a phenomenon that sometimes have fatal results. Each one of us have multiple sources of information, and sometimes it's impossible to discern what is truth or what is not truth, what is truth and what is a liar. Probably when Hannah Arendt write his books, one of the concepts Hannah Arendt shared is organizer liars. How different liars can organize information in order to share this information and create untruth. And today we have this misinformation in our country, in our society. And this, curiously, in the Gutenberg in the 15th century, the create of the invent to share information and to gain knowledge, it's one of the first principles to the democracy. Today, to share information not necessarily is a principle to become or to be a more powerful democracy. Básicamente lo que intento decir es, siempre hemos dicho que tener mucha información es la mejor forma de tener un juicio justo entre nosotros, o un juicio equilibrado, para tener la información necesaria para tomar decisiones en nuestra vida. Pues hoy lo tenemos en duda. Yo soy político, me lo digo muchas veces porque a veces tiene una percepción tan negativa este concepto que me lo tengo que decir para encontrarle cosas positivas, que las tiene, ¿no? A veces en el ámbito político la gente ya no dice la verdad, no le importa la verdad, pero lo más curioso es que tampoco le importa la mentira. Lo único que le importa es hablar, con una expresión inglesa que se llama bullshit, la expresión más coloquial inglés. No hay ya ni interés en tener verdad, o interés en tener la mentira como un soporte a lo que es nuestra argumentación. Cada uno puede pensar lo que quiera, ¿no? El gran problema en estos momentos es hablar por hablar y hablar para defender no se sabe qué. Yo creo que la expresión inglesa, yo no soy inglés, bullshit tiene una connotación bastante distinta que la connotación española. La connotación española es bastante complicada, ¿no? Pero la expresión inglesa es muy clara, gente que habla por hablar y sencillamente para no aportar nada. Un día muy interesante el de hoy, me sabe un moment no poder estar con todos vosotros, gràcies a l'acadèmia per la vostra feina i suposo que com que estem a streaming tindré capacitat de poder-ho veure. Muchas gracias and welcome to Barcelona.
Molt bona tarda a tothom. Jo només faré una presentació institucional, per dir-ho així, de l'acte. First of all, thank you very much, Jordi Banys, from the 4th Deputy Mayor of Barcelona, for giving us the opportunity of being here in this incredible place. This is organized by the Academia Europea, so the academies are institutions that always think whether try to understand their existence or try to ask, to wonder why they exist. And at the very end, there are several reasons. One of them is dissemination, is to talk to people, to let people know where we are. And today is one of these cases in which lots of people have been talking on the issue of disinformation. In general, I began saying fake news, and they told me this is not the right word for it, so you have to talk on disinformation. And so we did. So it's clear the case, because we want to have a view from academia, and that's the point. So in everything we organize at the Academia Europea, we want to have this view. We want to have the view of people studying things, trying to understand what's going on through the pathway of science. And this is why we are here, what we are here today. And the Academy, the European Academy, is one of these institutions. Nowadays, we are settled at the Fundació Catalana per a la Recerca i la Innovació, which are, for us, it's the perfect place of being within the community. We have the two main sponsors, the municipality here and the Generalitat de Catalunya, and our activities, most of you know the activities we are doing. We are doing the scientific dialogues. Some of you have been participating on that. We have the Hypatia Prize that is going to be announced in a couple of days. We have the Arts and Science, and we have the Disputatio. This what we are doing here, in this case on misinformation. On misinformation, I began trying to see who was working for that, on that, and thanks to Marcel Mauri, I could know Ruth Rodríguez. She's the person that is going to handle the Disputatio. And when we were talking on how to organize that, we asked to have some music in the event, and she asked to have the word, the voice. And immediately, thanks to the bad influences of Xavier Calzamiga, I thought on Joan Magraner. Joan is here. He is one of the main composers, the young composers of music, of the Catalan music today. And what we are going to have is the performance of two brief pieces at the beginning and two brief pieces at the end. In both cases, these are pieces that Joan Magrané did on the poems that are called tankas in Japanese of Félicie Fusté. And yesterday, by luck, I went to an art exhibition for the inauguration, and guess what? Where was the exhibition? It was in the foundation of Félicie Fusté, and I recommend you all to go to see this exhibition of Kima Guitart, in which you are going to see very, very interesting things there. Mireia Tarragó y Esther Pinyol are the two performers that are going to show us the voice of Félicie Fusté to all of us, and they are going to perform now and afterwards at the end of the event. So, Ruth, everything is in your hands right now.
Bona tarda. Thank you very much to Deputy Mayor, Councillors, Professor Bertrand Petit, and the Academia Europea for the opportunity to discuss disinformation this evening. Disinformation is one of the major concerns of democratic countries, and it has a huge impact in different aspects of our lives. From the erosion of democratic institutions, the polarization of public opinion, the perception of climate change, and also our personal well-being. This is why we deeply appreciate the attention that the Academia Europea and the Barcelona City Council are dedicating to this issue today, which demands an interdisciplinary approach, because addressing disinformation requires the collaboration of diverse key players, such as academic experts, political institutions, industry, and society as a whole. And to discuss and explore solutions to this issue, we have two distinguished experts with us, Professor Lucas Graves and Professor Ramón Salaverría. Thank you for joining us. But before introducing them and inviting them to speak, I would like to welcome, as you were mentioning, soprano Mireia Tarragó and harpist Esther Pinyol. Just because when we are surrounded by noise, it becomes essential to carefully select the voices that accompany us, and we also recognize the value of connecting diverse disciplines, in this case, music and poetry, to attain harmony, beauty, and in the end, truth. Mireia Tarragó, Esther Pinyol, welcome. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful performance. And now it is time to engage in dialogue with our guest. I'm delighted that after attempting to meet at many conferences around the world, Professor Lucas Graves and Professor Ramón Salaverría are finally together today in this very special venue. Allow me to introduce them to you. Professor Lucas Graves is just arrived from the US, where he is full professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has studied the phenomenon of disinformation from a global perspective, as well as one of the most powerful tools we have to fight it, fact-checking platforms. Specializing in media, political fact-checking, net neutrality, and the open source movement, his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Columbia Journalism Review, and the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard University. He has been a research fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy at Columbia University in New York. His research has been supported by the American Press Institute, the Poynter Institute, the Duke's Reporter Lab, and the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. And if we want to discuss and better understand this information in the European context, it is necessary to talk to Professor Ramón Salaverría, who is full professor of journalism at University of Navarra. Since this year, he is member of Academia Europea, and his research focuses on digital journalism and disinformation. He is the principal investigator of eVerifier, the Iberian Digital Media Observatory funded by the European Commission. He is member of the Arbitration, Complaints, and Ethics of Journalism Commission in Spain, and chair of Journalism Studies section of ECREA. They will help us to better understand how academia defines this information, explores the key aspect that we need to better understand this phenomenon, and look into the tools we have to defeat this type of misleading content. Well, we can try. Start with the questions. Yeah? Okay. So just to start, before Professor Bertrand-Petit was already mentioning this aspect, I would like to ask you that in many cases we are just hearing about fake news, disinformation, misinformation. Which is actually the best term that defines what we are talking about and why?
Maybe you can start yourself.
Okay. So first, let me say thank you to everybody for being here, and especially I'd love to thank the European Academy and the City Council for making this possible. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to be able to join you and to talk about this really important question with Dr. Rodríguez and Professor Salaverría. This is such a vital question in societies around the world today, so I hope that we can shed some light. So what is the right word to use? I mean, I think about this a lot. You know, there's no question that if we were in this room 70 years ago, having this same conversation, we would not be using the word disinformation, we would not be talking about misinformation. I'm sure you can guess what word we would be using. I mean, I think at least we would probably be talking about propaganda, right? And that was the sort of the reigning framework, the reigning concept for making sense of the potential harms of false information, the way that it harms society. But of course, our vocabulary for deception and for lying, it evolves with our media, with our technology, and with our societies. So today, absolutely, the sort of term of art, the accepted scientific language, is misinformation and disinformation. You can read tens of thousands of papers published in the last several years focused on this topic because academics are very trendy. You know, they love to jump on the latest issues. And those, I mean, they're very adequate terms. They capture a key distinction, which of course is intent. Whenever you're talking about falsehoods, the first thing you want to know is it deliberate or is it not? So misinformation, and people use this a bit differently, but in my understanding, misinformation refers to false information in general, And we should recognize that in human societies, we're always surrounded by false information, by things that aren't true. And in many cases, that's fine, right? So I grew up being convinced that if you swallowed a piece of gum, it would stay in your stomach for exactly 7 years. No more, no less. I was told all through my childhood, 7 years. And everybody said this, right? I heard this from my friends. It was something we always repeated. I asked my students a couple of weeks ago if they'd heard this myth, and they had, and it's still 7 years. I don't know if it's different here, but so there are many narratives which aren't true, but which we still use to build culture, to build community, to form our identities, and that's entirely normal. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false information which is spread strategically, deliberately to achieve some goal. That goal could be commercial, selling something. It could be political, winning an election, etc. It's really important to say that it's difficult to draw a clean line between the two. So almost any major false narrative which you think of, which has been in the news, in the last decade, there are elements of both, right? So if you think about the anti-vaccine community, which was already mentioned, that includes people who truly believe in alternative medicine, people who are suspicious, sometimes for good reason, of the medical establishment, and they want to share what they think is, the healthiest approach and help other people to live healthier lives. They're mistaken in recommending that people don't get vaccines, but they're not deliberately spreading disinformation. But you also have, of course, many politicians who exploit that narrative, whatever they believe, they're exploiting that narrative to get elected, and you have companies that are exploiting it to sell, fake cures. So the world is messy. There's always a mix of misinformation and disinformation in these narratives. The last thing I'll say, in terms of defining it, is that disinformation ultimately is about power, right? And it's too easy to forget that. Actually, that's one reason I think we should bring back the word propaganda sometimes, because when somebody speaks of propaganda, you immediately think, whose propaganda, right? Who is manipulating us with propaganda? You lose that a bit sometimes with misinformation and disinformation. Mm-hmm. But disinformation is always about power. It's about manipulation. And if our title makes sense of disinformation, the invisible threat, I think the part that's invisible sometimes is power, right? Who is benefiting from a particular false narrative, from a particular bit of disinformation?
Thank you so much. So it seems that we talk about an old concept, but in a new context, we observe the declining trust in the media, fluid notions of truth. Is this really new? Ramón, you have any opinion on this?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm very honored as well today. And this is a special occasion because, as you mentioned, I have been reading and following the work of my admired colleague, Lucas Graves. So this is the first time that we meet in person for the first time.
And we've been trying.
Yeah, so it's a great occasion that we all will remember. Well, is it new? It is new in some terms. Obviously, the lying has been something that has been connected to human from the very beginning. In history, when you read the old books, the history books, you always find lying as the ignition of the action. And that comes until today. But it is true that today we have some specific nuances or characteristics or features that make these phenomena different from the past. I will mention basically three main characteristics, which are basically volume, speed, and scope. I mean, volume in terms of the size of disinformation and the lying that we are exposed to as a society. Also the speed, because due to the networks, we are exposed to that content in a very speedy way. And obviously the scope, because it's global, dimension of the lies reach all the 5 continents and every corner of this world. And I will also mention, besides these 3 characteristics, some other less known or less detected characteristics that will be the actors, the channels, and the languages of this information. Because it is true that there has been always the powerful people behind the control of the public discussion. But nowadays there are some other actors that are also arising in the public sphere that are connected to this phenomena. Also, the channels is extremely important in this case because we have the social media, so social networks as a principal channel for the global dissemination of this content. And finally, the languages, because this information is adopting new ways of expressing nowadays we might talk about artificial intelligence and some other technologies, but we see that this information is not just reaching us through languages, I mean through words, but also through images, through sounds, through video. So it's a very diverse, I will say, more than in the past phenomenon.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer because I also, I think about this question all the time, and I'd like to have it both ways. Because on one hand, it's too easy sometimes to blame social media or the internet for bringing a new wave of disinformation that has, changed everything and taken us out of some golden age when politicians always said the truth and the media were always accurate and people didn't believe conspiracy theories. Of course, there was no golden age like that, right? This is not something new. But on the other hand, and by the way, I really dislike the phrase post-truth for this reason. I don't know how you feel about this, but for several years it was very fashionable to hear people talking about post-truth. There were, 200 book titles published with post-truth.
It was even accepted by the Spanish dictionary.
The Real Academia.
Yes.
And by the Oxford English Dictionary, I think. But I don't like that because it suggests that we were in the age of truth and now we're in the age of post-truth. And that's far too simple. But I really agree that the lived experience, the way that we experience false information changes when our media and our technologies evolve. One of the big findings of psychological research about disinformation is that people, when we reason about things, when we try to analyze problems, we very often think like lawyers and not like scientists, right? We try to come up with reasons to defend the beliefs we have that are important to our identity or to our community, etc., instead of judging things the way that we imagine a scientist would. And today, we have many more tools to do that effectively, to engage in that kind of reasoning very effectively. I mean, again, if you think about the anti-vaxxers, there have always been anti-vaxxers since there have been vaccines. There were anti-vaxxers in the 1990s in the United States. I remember seeing a documentary about this. But today, they can talk to each other, they can do research, they can harvest, scientific research, but use it in a selective way to try to support their arguments. So the way that the culture forms around false information is different because we're communicating in different ways.
Good. Thank you so much for clarifying these aspects and also just to helping us understand the particular characteristics of our context that changed the idea of disinformation or that idea of truth today. Just to think about the social impact of disinformation, according to the Eurobarometer survey published in July this year, the 45% of respondents consider that fake news and disinformation are issues with a significant impact on them. So do you think that the effects of disinformation on society are really that concerning?
They are concerning. We can see this problem as a distant problem that only affects the political sphere, for instance, but we just need to remember 2-3 years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the vaccine-related disinformation was extremely harmful for society. It led to some people to vaccine hesitancy. And well, I haven't seen studies analyzing what was the real impact of that disinformation in terms, maybe you know some in the United States, but what was the real physical harm of that disinformation for the people. So it does have, of course, some social impact. But beyond that, we should also recall some other effects in the society, such as erosion of trust. And I think that this is the biggest concern that we should have, because we don't trust each other due to disinformation. We think that the others are trying to deceive us. And due to that mistrust, it begins to increase the polarization and the social division. And this can be seen in many countries. You come from the United States now, and you can tell us your story, but we can tell you our story too, because this is happening everywhere. And also, I will say that in more specific areas, we should also consider some effects related to national security threats in terms of hybrid warfare, because this is being used recently by some powerful countries, and we see now in Israel, in Ukraine, how this is being used to produce this kind of instability. So my opinion is that, of course, although there are some voices that say, well, you know, this is not so important, you might have heard that, but I truly believe that it does.
Can I add something to that? Yeah. It's okay if we both talk to each question, yeah?
Okay, good.
So I also think it's very harmful, but not in the ways that we usually imagine. So as Ramón just mentioned, there are actually many studies, and they're very rigorous scientific studies using controlled experiments. There are many studies that show that, number one, people encounter much less fake news online than we imagine. We think they're surrounded by it. But actually, as a percentage of their overall news diet, of their information diet, it's very, very small, surprisingly small. And even when they do encounter it, again in experiments, it doesn't have a very great impact, right? There's a long tradition of minimal effects in research. Seeing a fake message or a conspiracy theory doesn't change your attitudes or your beliefs, right away. Of course not, right? So I think we have the wrong metaphor for the harms of disinformation. We usually talk about it like a virus, where it hurts society because it spreads around and it infects every individual. But actually, that's not a very good metaphor. I think it's better to think of it like it's like a machine. The way it harms society is that it's like rust in a machine, and it affects some key components, so the machine doesn't function anymore. Or maybe it's like cancer in a body, and it affects a key organ, and then the body can't stay healthy, right? So just as we heard, disinformation harms us by eroding trust, and especially by weakening the institutions that we count on to promote public accountability, right? So when we're in an environment saturated with misinformation, it's easier for politicians to act as if it doesn't matter what they say. You know, it eliminates the mechanisms that we have to pressure our leaders to make rational arguments and to say things that are true. And so it really erodes the key institutions that we depend on so we can have a sort of sensible politics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sometimes when we think about disinformation, we are just worried about the things that we can believe that they are true, but sometimes the main concerns about disinformation is just the role of disinformation in the role that plays in just erodes this possibility to believe in things. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's not just what you believe, just the destruction of the system that you start to put in question, or some ideas that you start to see with some kind of not so clear opinion, or you just start putting in question. And you were just referring many times about the idea of technology. It seems that the impact of technology is evident when discussing disinformation, and perhaps a recent example of this is just Elon Musk's influence on the US election. What role do technology and also social media play in all this ecosystem, in all these contexts?
Maybe you can take on
Can I
this.
start?
I will make a take myself.
So I guess I would just repeat what I started to say before, which is that every new media technology brings new cultures of disinformation, new styles, new habits of misinformation. So if we think about the broadcast era, right, when radio and then eventually television first became important communications medium, of course the disinformation that we worried about in that case was propaganda, centralized state propaganda, right? And there have been many arguments historically that attributed the rise of fascism, for instance, in part to the ability for the state to share these very influential messages in a new way. I don't think that's actually, I mean, I think that's a bit reductive, right? I don't think it's so simple. But that's what we believed. That's how we talked about it. Because that was the concern we had about misinformation in that media environment. Or you can think about, I think the example that best sort of anticipates where we are today is if you think about the United Kingdom, where for a long time there's been a culture of these tabloid newspapers that are very sensational. They publish, ridiculous stories. I mean, when they're true, they're stretching the truth, they're attacking people, but they're very popular, and they have incredible political force. They exert a really strong influence on politics in the United Kingdom. In England, it's said that Tony Blair only won in the 1990s because Rupert Murdoch, who owns many of those tabloids, said, okay, we're going to let, he made a deal with Rupert Murdoch. I don't know if that's true, but even the rumor, even the myth, suggests the kind of power that the people who own those media outlets can have in using disinformation. So I think that's kind of, with the example of Elon Musk, that's sort of where we are today, except again, the key difference is that when it comes to social media and cultures of misinformation, there's a lot of audience participation, right? Really what we see very often is you have narratives that circulate out there, they're not causing that much harm, and then a politician grabs them, takes advantage of them and weaponizes them, and then they gain much more force, and also they enable real harms by the state. So just to give you one quick example of that, the most terrible moment, I think, in the recent U.S. election was the moment when Donald Trump repeated this really outrageous and ugly rumor that immigrants in Ohio were eating people's pets. It's ridiculous, it's really insulting and harmful. But of course, that was already circulating online. There were some influencers who were sharing that. And Donald Trump and J.D. Vance were able to point to those narratives and say, well, some people are saying this. You know, we're not for sure it's true, but we think it might be true. And then it gains much more force, right? And maybe many people who then share it, it's not clear whether they believe it or they just think that it reflects the danger of immigration or something, but it gains much more force. And it helps to justify the policies which we will now see in the United States, you know, when, say, if Trump launches a program of mass deportations. So again, disinformation causes a lot of harm, but it causes harm when it's weaponized by political actors.
Mm-hmm. I would like to make a short take on this about the role of social media. You previously mentioned a wrong metaphor between virus and machines.
The rusty machine, I like that.
Rusty machine. I do think that we have also used a wrong metaphor for understanding the role of social media, because we initially understood social media as an agora, but we all learned finally that it's more like a coliseum, bloody coliseum. And this, I think, is the right metaphor for social media right now. And because we have to learn that the core concept of social media is not veracity, is not truth, is engagement. A good content for social media is not a true content, but the content that is massively shared by the people. And it happens, sadly, that the wrong, I mean, the lying or disinformation content is more prone to be distributed by the people, shared by the people. So this is one of the main problems, in my opinion.
Can I add just one more quick thing about that? I agree completely, and what's really interesting and important is that it doesn't only change the way people behave on social media, it also changes the way that politicians speak and the way that they act, and also the way that the news media, right, even when they're in other environments, right? So of course, newspaper headlines look different today than they did 20 years ago because they need to be viral on social media, they need to work on the internet. So we've all seen how newspaper headlines change. Well, the same thing happens with politicians, and you have some political entrepreneurs all around the world, there are many examples in the US, who, you know, when they're in Congress, when they're in a debate, when they're giving a speech, what they're trying to do is create clips which will then go viral on social media. So that encourages them to speak in ways that they would not have spoken before, right? And to behave in different ways. So it's a really pervasive effect.
Mm-hmm. You want to? Yeah, I think it's interesting how sometimes we were just thinking that from the analogic sphere was just having an influence on the digital sphere, and now it's perhaps the other way around. Just the digital sphere is just having such a great influence on the analogic sphere that sometimes when we think about this information, we just wait till we can see the visible effects of that, but the visible effects are already here. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the invisible are in the social media, but we can already see the visible effects just as a result of elections, but many other examples that we can see and that are affecting our lives. So it is interesting, the binomium between analogic, digital, visible, invisible, just to see the effects of actually the same phenomenon and different manifestations. Mm-hmm. And talking about also technology, we are talking all the time about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is just changing our lives. So in which way artificial intelligence can have an impact or can influence this phenomenon? What do you think about that?
Well, obviously, we have seen recently that in many occasions, It's a technology able to create in a very sophisticated way apparent truthful content, which is actually false indeed. But also, I think that there are some other dimensions that we should care about. For instance, the targeted dissemination, because these technologies can really transmit the content to specific audiences and even to customize content. And I believe that in the future that can be a truly worrying situation, because if nowadays we have general disinformation, but in the future we could reach to customized disinformation, and that could be a really, really complicated situation. And another complicated situation is the current large language models, which are being trained by large sets of data, text, images, all sorts of multimodal content, and so far we don't know exactly what is the source of that information, and we might reasonably expect that most or a large amount of that content is somehow disinformation content as well. So that means that for the future, artificial intelligence could be sort of laundering that content in order to produce a content that will be offered to artificial intelligence users. So beyond the most obvious impact of generative AI, I think there are some other dimensions that we should take care about.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And it's interesting that there was a lot of concern this year. This year there were elections all around the world. It was called the Year of Elections. I think countries representing more than half of the world's population held elections. So there was a lot of concern about the role that deep fakes might play. And these are, fakes, but they're made with AI, so maybe it's a video or an audio, and it's very convincing. So there was a lot of fear that this would have a big impact. Actually, this year, it didn't yet, but it will, right? It's absolutely inevitable that at some point, at a critical juncture during an election or some political event, there will be a fake that's so good that it raises questions and maybe it changes the outcome, right? And there's not enough time for journalists to investigate it or for lawyers to investigate it. So that's really worrying. I just want to add to that very quickly. An even more fundamental way that AI will have an impact on disinformation is that it is challenging all of the institutions that safeguard truth. So, journalism, academia, scientific institutions, the way that they work will change, and we don't know exactly how, but already anyone who teaches and anyone who's a professor knows that you have to think again about how do you evaluate student work, what does it mean to have an original idea, what is an appropriate way to use these tools. It means that the systems of credibility, the systems of accreditation that we rely on, now in the whole modern era, they may shift. We may not rely on the same mechanisms or procedures for saying what is the best knowledge, what is the most reliable knowledge. And it's not clear how that will change, but that also may create a more open, a more fertile ground for disinformation.
Yeah, actually, perhaps what we can demand or we can ask to artificial intelligence is something that we have been asking to many players so far, that is related to transparency. I mean, we need to know more things about the content and more things about the technology that we are using, just to know much better which is the type of content that the technology is using, how it's moderated. So perhaps that can help a little bit us how to deal with the results that we get from that technology. And we were just talking about the idea of disinformation as a global phenomenon, but sometimes we are dealing with a global phenomenon that is regulated in a different way. And not all the context, or not all the geographical contexts have the same regulation, and perhaps that also affects the way we can deal not only with this information, but also with the technologies that can disseminate or can produce this type of content. So we have been talking about the problems, the influence, the effects of this information, and I don't want to, I just want to give some kind of bright side or positive aspects to this conversation, talking about possible solutions. What can we do in order to fight disinformation? What tools are available to counter disinformation? Because we are surrounded by fact-checking and media literacy programs and so on, but does any of it make a real difference? What do you think about this?
So I think it does make a difference. Again, there's different ways that it has an effect. You can think about when it comes to fact-checking, you can think about the individual effect, and by now there's much research that shows that if somebody who believes a false claim reads a fact-check, it does have an effect on their belief. It makes it somewhat more likely that they will believe the truth and not believe that false claim. And again, this has been confirmed by just countless studies at this point. Now, the problem is that very often the people who have a particular false belief are not the people who are seeing the fact check,
Exactly.
which is relevant to that belief. So that's a huge problem. But still, it's important that this information is available for anyone who wants it. But I'll just say quickly, there are many other ways that fact-checking and fact-checkers can have an impact. So a lot of fact-checkers try to work at the structural level. They try to influence politicians. So they try to raise the cost for a politician who says something that's not true. Sometimes that works, obviously not all the time, but there are some politicians who will change their rhetoric if one or more fact-checkers say, no, you can't keep making that claim about the economy because it's not true. Sometimes they'll say, thank you for correcting me, and they'll change what they say. But also, they work with institutions like the EU. I mean, fact-checkers in Europe were involved in creating the code of practice to regulate Meta and Google and TikTok and the other, because they're experts in this area, right? They're experts in disinformation, so they help to create the rules for these companies. They also partner with those companies to identify fake stuff, which then circulates less on the platform. And sometimes they advocate for new laws in their own countries, right? For new transparency laws. So yeah, there's many ways to make a difference at the institutional level.
They make a difference, but we must acknowledge that fact-checking and even media literacy as well are peripheral to mainstream media consumption. Sometimes mainstream media, for instance, during the recent elections, both in the US, here in Europe, try some experiences of fact-checking during candidate debates and things like that. But that dimension of journalism remains peripheral, in my opinion.
That's true.
And probably this means that in order to have a larger impact, probably mainstream media should embrace fact-checking as one of the usual dimension of their activity, because they do it just very sporadically, right? And at the same time, I will say that fact-checking, and you know very well because you have been researching that for a long time, fact-checking is evolving. I mean, the idea, I think that the very concept, the very term of fact-checking is beginning to be somehow outdated, because it's not just that. It's not just that. I have been thinking on that recently, and I saw an approach which I called the reactive approach to disinformation, which is whenever something that has already spread publicly, you react. But nowadays, fact-checkers are changing their way of acting, and they are trying to take a step forward, disinformation. So they are beginning proactive, and they have started to produce a lot of explainers, a lot of cautionary contents, things like that, that try to raise awareness among the people about the possible threats of disinformation. And this is especially visible, for instance, in recent elections. At least here in Europe, I was a witness of that, because here in Europe, I actually contributed myself through the observatory that I am coordinating. We try to, raise the awareness of people about the possible disinformation narratives related to elections, because they have repeated throughout the time. So if you take this a step forward, probably you are beginning to be more effective. That's my impression.
Yeah, sometimes we can see that these tools are just going beyond the true or false verdict, and they are going more to the why, explaining why things are happening, and sometimes trying to detect, identify which are
beware. Beware, because this can come.
Yes, just to identify the future questions of population, of citizens, and I think that is very interesting. Just referring to the idea of public service, that is one of the main aspects of journalism and also the fact-checking role. So I hope that this conversation, this Disputatio, has helped you to answer many questions, but now we have time, around 10 minutes, to listen to your questions, to your doubts, and the floor is open.
We'd love to hear if you encounter disinformation in your life in a way that you think makes a difference. That would be really interesting to know.
Yes.
I mean, do you feel like it's a threat? Did we come up with a good name for this? For this panel?
Bueno, hay un pasillito aquí. Thank you very much. Your insights were super enlightening and interesting. I introduce myself. My name is Beatriz Garcia, and I'm a lawyer and a researcher in disinformation. From the legal perspective, we many times wonder what's the best way to try to curb this phenomenon, the spread of misinformation. Do you think the initiative should come from the regulator side in putting more limits to the spread of misinformation, or should this come more from the platforms? Who should be taking the lead? Thank you.
Well, in Europe, I think that we are a step ahead of other regions in the world in that sense, because nowadays we already have a legal framework that is probably the most complete. I don't know if it's enough, but it's the most complete so far globally, and it provides some framework for other countries and other regions when they want to tackle this problem. So I do think, of course, that a legal, sufficient and adequate legal framework is necessary, but it's not enough. You need some other sort of activities or fronts of action in order to curb the problem. Of course, I think that journalism is one of the main ways of tackling this problem, but also education. I think that it's a long-term way of tackling the problem, but unless we really invest and we really understand that through education we can really transform the people's behavior regarding the their behavior in social media and the new digital environment, we, even if we have the hardest laws, probably we won't solve the problem anyway.
And I would just add that regulation is more possible in some environments than others. I mean, I really admire the European regulatory approach. In the United States, we don't have that. We had some incremental steps, but now the Trump administration has said that they're going to, they're really going to go after any agencies, any government agencies that are working with researchers or working with technology companies to try to limit disinformation. They say that that's censorship. They call it the censorship industrial complex. And so already, this is making people who study disinformation in US universities, they're afraid to do their research, right? And they're afraid to talk about it in public. They're afraid of being pulled before Congress and called censors. So this is becoming a very politicized question. And it's impossible that we would get a regulatory approach like the European one, in the US in the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much. The word education fell, and the question is, what kind of education? I have the feeling that fact-checking is one element, but the kind of information that we want to have in particular political debates is always like moving from one topic to another, and the fact-checkers are always behind what's the next topic, right? And so politicians can move from one topic to another. The case of the cats and dogs lie in Ohio was particularly good. They could just let it drop the moment that the fact-checkers had made it clear, and they actually, neither Vance nor Trump, after like 2 or 3 interviews, continued with that thing. They continued with other stuff, namely that there had been fraud in the 2020 election of a significant scale and so on. And that's a more difficult thing for people to detect as a kind of disinformation, because it's not a blatant lie. There's always a certain amount of election fraud. People try to vote when they're not allowed to, or try to vote twice, or something like that. The question there is not whether that was a blatant lie, but whether a certain truth is told in intentionally misleading ways. And people need to learn that kind of stuff at schools. This is not about facts, this is about skills of critical thinking that they need to learn. When would you start that?
So I agree with you very much that it's about critical thinking. The irony is that, as I mentioned before, and research shows this also, that sometimes people who have the strongest critical thinking skills, who are the most educated, who know how to find information, very often they're the ones who are best at finding narratives to support what they already believe. So I think that really, along with education, and I don't know how you do this, but along with education, the goal has to be to rebuild trust in institutions, right? Because as Ramón mentioned before, I mean, the great weakness is if somebody's convinced that all journalism can't be trusted, or it's all just political, they think every organization is like the worst ones, they assume it's all meaningless, or they think the government can never be trusted, then it's really impossible to make facts count. You have to have a system of trust, a system of credibility. So I think that's one thing that education has to focus on, even as it teaches people to be critical of information from authorities. You see what I mean? So it's a very delicate balance.
Let me add one point. You asked what kind of education. I will suggest cross-generational education, because when we use the word education, we usually focus only on youngsters, on children. But this is a social problem that affects all segments of society, and especially the elderly people, those in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and even beyond, why not? They are extremely exposed. They have a lack of training regarding the tools, the languages. So they are one of the probably most exposed segment of society towards disinformation. So and even I will say some other vulnerable groups as well. For instance, immigrants. I was talking about that yesterday in another place. But let's think on that. We have we are always talking about the problem of or the situation of immigration right now. But let's think on immigration from the disinformation point of view. Usually the focus is only immigration is used as a concept or as a subject for disinformation. But what happens with the immigrant people who don't speak local language and are exposed to the disinformation that comes from their modern countries, and they are maybe filtered by mafias that are interested in telling them, look, it's great, you can reach the place. You see, there are many dimensions there that should be addressed. So education and media literacy should be focused in many different segments of society. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have two questions that are related, and it's when we talk, so what do we mean when we say that there is an increase in misinformation? Are we talking in absolute terms? Are we talking in relative terms? And is it important whether we are exposed to a lot of misinformation or it's in relative terms? Because we know that the amount of information where we are exposed it has increased, right, exponentially lately.
Well, it's quite difficult to measure because the very nature of this information is hidden, so you can't really measure that. One of the aims that the European Commission has through the network of observatories in which we are nowadays working since 2021 is basically that. Trying to create a sort of European dashboard, analyzing the levels of disinformation exposure in every time. But I can tell you, this is truly difficult.
Yeah. It's very difficult because, as we were saying before, the nature of disinformation changes. I mean, can we say there's more disinformation now than during the Crusades or the Inquisition, or the 1800s in the United States, when politicians, they would routinely spread the most horrible lies about each other. But of course, it was less visible then because we weren't all on the same networks where we could track every single unit. But it's hard to say what should even be the unit. Is it each post, or is it a narrative? About immigration or any other subject. So I agree, it's very hard to measure.
My name is Ramón Salaverría. I'm a doctoral researcher at UPF, and I'm doing research on crisis communication of public health agencies during COVID-19 pandemic.
We don't hear it very well. No.
Sorry. Hello. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. I'm Saman Chaudhary. I'm a doctoral researcher at UPF Communication Department. I'm doing research on the crisis communication of public health agencies during COVID-19 pandemic. And since we are talking about politicians and institutions, I did my research on World Health Organization, CDC, and MSF, and I found out that even the major players that are responsible for dealing with the public health crisis, they did not have the same narrative. And if we talk about Trump and CDC, we had lots of problems. So when we are talking about institutional distrust, how do we deal the problem from the top? Here we are talking about media literacy and fact-checking platforms, but what about the organizations that are responsible for regulating the behaviors of citizens during a public health emergency? I would really like your yeah, your opinion on recommendations on that. Thank you.
That's such a difficult question, and I think it's really interesting because when public health agencies communicate, they really care not only about truth, but they care about what actions are they going to, as you well know, right? What actions might result from the way that they speak, from what they say. So on the one hand, we want people to trust these agencies, and we want them to have a similar message, but on the other hand, all the agencies had different advice, at least in different countries, right? And many of them made mistakes. I mean, initially in the United States, the advice was don't wear a mask for the first couple of months or the first several weeks. But it's very difficult for Anthony Fauci, for some public health official to say, oh, we made a mistake, because they don't want to lower trust even more. So I don't know the answer to the question, but it's a very good one.
Neither do I.
It's the hardest problem.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. My name is Andrei Bespalov. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Pompeu Fabra University, and I work on fake news conspiracy theories as a form of civil disobedience. So I want to remind you quickly of one interesting twist of the cats and dogs stories. After J.D. Vance was confronted on CNN on spreading this story, he said the following: if I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that is what I am going to do. So my question to both of you, do you think that spreading fake news, conspiracy theories can ever be justifiable? Thank you.
Can what?
Can be justified.
Can be justified. Oof. I don't think we believe that. But we see that it's a sort of leniency regarding that situation nowadays, at least at the political sphere. They are accepting that as a viable way of behaving. And this is not just a disinformation problem, that's a value problem, that's a moral problem.
I would just say it's an interesting philosophical question because, of course, many movements that we admire, social movements, political movements, reform movements, some part of their narrative, like not all of their narrative was true, whether it's women's rights or the civil rights movement in the United States. When you're fighting rhetorical fights, there's always exaggeration, there's always narratives that, I mean, maybe they're true to you, but they're not true to from everybody's point of view. So it does get a little bit tricky, but I absolutely agree. There's no justification for knowingly spreading conspiracy theories or false beliefs, even though we do see this in history.
Okay. Well, we have now the last question. Yep. Thank you.
Yes, my question is the relationship that of all you have been saying with what we would call the empire of subjectivity. So the way we see subjectivity has been empowered in the last years. So subjectivity was something that was allowed to artists, that was not allowed to scientists, and the idea that doesn't matter what you think, whether it is reasonable, it is true or not. Nowadays, if you subjectively believe something, that's okay. And this is something that has changed quite dramatically in the last years, and maybe a big part of the idea of the post-truth you began with comes from that, in the sense that there is, if subjectivity is going to be empowered, then doesn't matter the reality. How do you see that?
Well, you have used the term subjectivity. I will say probably relativism, huge relativism. The idea that, nobody cares about truth, so I can say whatever I want because I have the right to do so. But socially, we should actually reinforce the relevance, the importance of truth, because otherwise we are breaking the connections and the ties between citizens. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree. I do. A lot of people have wanted to blame. There was a moment in 2017, 2018 when everybody wanted to say it was postmodernism that created this culture of relativism. Yep. And I have a problem with that. I don't know if obscure French theories that some of us read in graduate school, I don't know if you know post-structuralism or postmodernism, Foucault, Derrida, are responsible for the ability of these really malicious actors to spread lies, or for popular attitudes towards truth. I think there's a missing link there. But it's true that within a particular knowledge domain, like within a science, you have particular standards, right? Every science has their own way of testing knowledge. They have their own systems of credibility, and sometimes those are different. But the point is that you have to have one within the discipline that you're talking to, within the conversation you're trying to have.
Well, thank you so much for this Disputatio, for this conversation. I must say that I will keep listening to you and learning with what you are just explaining to us the rest of the night, all the time, but I must also say that I can't wait to listen to the second performance. I think that the first performance was so beautiful that we are still waiting for the second part, that Quatre Tanques, and I would like to welcome Mireia Tarragó and Esther Piñol again for the second part of their performance. Thank you so much.
Si t'has sgaricciamo
It's really beautiful.
Well, thank you so much to Mireia Tarragó, Esther Piñol, and of course, Joan Magrané for being here tonight. And again, thank you to Academia Europea, Professor Lucas Graves and Professor Ramón Salaverría for just helping us to understand much better this phenomenon and just to make us think a little bit more in a critical way when we are just dealing with different types of content, and perhaps instead of just automatically sharing what we receive, just stop and think twice if what we are seeing is true or not. So thank you so much for making us think about this. And I guess all these questions and answers that you were giving us and just helping us to better understand this are still with us, and you are still making questions about this topic. Well, we will have now a photographic session with disputants and musicians, and afterwards, I would like to invite you to have a glass of cava at the Gothic Hall. So you are invited to share that moment with our guests tonight, and just to finish the event. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.